My name is Claire. I always thought of myself as a dedicated wife, a loving mother. Life was predictable, comfortable, even if the passion had slowly drained from my marriage. But then one warm, ordinary morning, everything changed. It happened so fast. One touch, one glance, and it flipped my world upside down. Who knew a simple offer to help could stir something inside me that I had buried for years? How far would it go? What lines would I cross? This is a story about how a single moment, something that should have meant nothing, awakened feelings I never thought I'd experience again. It all started while I was decorating the garden for my daughter Emily's birthday. Greg, my husband, was off at work, as usual, buried in another project. As I stood on a shaky ladder, struggling to hang the string lights around the patio, I heard a voice behind me, deep and familiar. "Need a hand with that, Mrs. Parker?" I nearly lost my balance as I turned to see who it was. Michael, the son of my best friend, Diane, stood there, smiling. But there was something different about him now. He was no longer the boy I had known for years. He had grown into a man, confident, strong. "Oh, Michael," I said, trying to steady myself, my breath catching in my throat. "I didn't hear you come in." He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab the ladder, steadying it for me. And in that small, almost insignificant moment, when our hands brushed, something surged through me, something I didn't expect, something I hadn't felt in years. I climbed down slowly, trying to calm the sudden rush of emotions. But it was too late. A crack had already formed in the life I had so carefully built. As Michael helped me finish up the decorations, I tried to keep things light, casual. But every time our hands met, my heart raced a little faster. I forced myself to ask about college, the most harmless conversation I could think of. "How's school going?" I asked, reaching for another string of lights. I couldn't meet his eyes for long, worried that he might see what I was trying so hard to ignore. "Pretty good, Mrs. Parker," he said with a smile, his voice relaxed, confident. "The usual classes, parties. But it's good to be home. Everything feels simpler here." I laughed, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Yeah, simpler," I echoed, though nothing felt simple at that moment. I watched him as he moved around the yard, effortlessly hanging lights, smoothing out the tablecloths. His presence filled the space between us in a way that was unsettling and exciting all at once. I kept telling myself this was innocent, that there was nothing wrong. But deep down, I knew better. The sun began to set, and soon enough, the guests started arriving. The garden was alive with laughter, conversations blending into the background noise. But amidst all that, I couldn't stop my eyes from wandering, searching for Michael. And when I finally saw him, it felt like the world around us faded. He was by the drinks table, surrounded by friends, telling some story that had everyone hanging on his every word. His laughter was infectious, and I wasn't the only one drawn to him. But then his gaze shifted, landing on me, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. He smiled, that easy, knowing smile, and held up a glass toward me. "Mrs. Parker," he called out, his voice playful, "I saved your favorite. I know how much you love a good lemonade." I made my way over, trying to keep my composure. When our fingers brushed as I took the glass, that same electricity shot through me. I took a sip, mostly to give myself something to do, to hide the flood of emotions threatening to surface. "Thank you, Michael," I said softly, trying to sound casual. But I could feel the tension between us, that unspoken connection building, pulling me in. "You're very thoughtful." His eyes lingered on mine, and for a second, it felt like we were the only two people in the garden. "I try," he said, the words heavy with meaning. And just like that, we both knew. There was no denying it anymore. As the night went on, the party continued around us, but I barely noticed. Each time our paths crossed, it felt deliberate, like the universe was pushing us together, daring us to see where this might go. Every accidental touch, every glance we exchanged only made the pull between us stronger, more dangerous. When it was time to say goodbye, I found myself standing closer to him than I should have. The other guests were still lingering, saying their goodnights, but I barely heard them. "Good night, Mrs. Parker," Michael said softly, his voice low enough that only I could hear. His eyes held mine, the unspoken promise between us clear. "Good night, Michael," I whispered back, my heart pounding. His touch lingered as he let go of my hand, and as he walked away, I felt a strange mixture of guilt and anticipation twist inside me. I told myself to let it go, to forget about that touch, that moment. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. And I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. Days passed, but the memory of that night stayed with me, haunting my every quiet moment. Greg continued to be absorbed in his work, barely noticing the distance growing between us. The routine of our life felt heavier now, suffocating. Every time I thought about Michael, a surge of guilt would hit me, but it wasn't enough to stop the thoughts from coming. One afternoon, I escaped to a small cafe in town, a place I went to when I needed to clear my head. The familiar scent of coffee and pastries greeted me as I walked in, offering a small comfort. But as I glanced around for a seat, my heart skipped a beat. Michael was sitting at a table in the corner, his head buried in a book. Before I could think of what to do, he looked up and smiled. "Mrs. Parker, what a surprise," he said, waving me over. I hesitated for a moment, but something inside me urged me forward. I crossed the room, my hands trembling slightly. "Hi, Michael. I didn't expect to see you here." He chuckled, closing his book. "I like to change up my study spots. Keeps me focused." He motioned to the empty chair across from him. "Care to join me?" I sat down, trying to stay calm, but my pulse was racing. The air between us was charged, the tension from the party still lingering. I sipped my coffee, grateful for something to do with my hands. "So, how's everything going?" We talked for a while, the conversation flowing easily despite the undercurrent of something more. He asked about my life, about Greg, about things that felt safe on the surface, but carried a weight beneath them. I told myself it was innocent, that it was just coffee. But deep down I knew it was anything but. As the afternoon wore on, Michael leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You know, Claire," he said, using my first name for the first time, "you're not at all what I expected." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He smiled, his eyes locking onto mine. "I guess I always thought you'd be more reserved."
But you're so much more than that.
"You're interesting." I laughed softly, though the compliment sent a thrill through me. "Well, thank you. I think." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and once again, that spark ignited between us. We both knew what was happening, but neither of us pulled away. "I've really enjoyed this," he said quietly, his gaze holding mine. "Me too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. And for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. Truly alive. After that afternoon in the cafe, I tried to go back to normal. I really did. But there was no ignoring the shift that had taken place. Every day that passed without hearing from Michael felt strange, almost like something was missing. It was unsettling, but at the same time, the excitement lingered, drawing me back to that moment in the cafe, his words, his touch. The days dragged on, Greg consumed by work as usual. I found myself spending more time alone, retreating to our quiet home after running errands or organizing Casey's activities. Even then, thoughts of Michael haunted me, and no matter how hard I tried to push them away, they only grew louder. A few days later, I was at home, struggling to fix something on my laptop that had been driving me crazy for weeks. The thought hit me like a jolt. Michael had mentioned he was good with tech. I sat there, my fingers hovering over my phone, debating with myself. Should I call him? Was that a step too far? But before I could second-guess myself any further, I dialed his number. "Hello." His voice came through the phone, and just hearing it sent my pulse racing. "Michael, it's Claire," I said, trying to sound casual but feeling anything but. "I'm having some trouble with my laptop. You mentioned you were good with computers. Could you maybe take a look at it?" There was a brief pause, and then his voice softened. "Of course. I'll be right over." When I hung up, I felt a wave of panic and anticipation roll through me. I moved around the house, straightening up things that didn't need to be touched, telling myself this was just help from a friend. But deep down, I knew better. The knock on the door came too quickly, and when I opened it, Michael stood there, smiling. My breath caught in my throat, but I managed to keep it together long enough to let him inside. "This won't take long," he said as he sat down at the desk and opened up my laptop, his fingers moving quickly over the keys. I stood behind him, watching his every move, my heart pounding in my chest. The tension between us was thick, unspoken but palpable. I could feel it with every inch that separated us, and when our shoulders accidentally brushed, it was like a spark ignited. As he worked, I leaned closer to see what he was doing, but when he turned his head, our faces were suddenly inches apart. I froze, the air between us charged with something dangerous, something I wasn't sure I could control. Our eyes locked, and before I knew it, we were kissing. It was soft at first, tentative, as if testing the waters of something we both knew we shouldn't dive into. But then the kiss deepened, and all the restraint I'd been holding onto dissolved in an instant. When we finally pulled away, breathless, the reality of what had just happened hit me hard. I took a step back, my hands trembling. "We can't," I whispered, my voice shaky, more trying to convince myself than him. This isn't right." Michael's eyes were full of regret, but also something deeper. "I know, Claire," he said softly. "I'm sorry." We finished fixing the laptop in silence, the tension between us thick but unspoken. When he finally left, I stood at the door, my heart still pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced, but one thing was clear. I wasn't ready to let go. And I wasn't sure if I ever would be. Days passed, but the guilt I'd felt after kissing Michael didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. My thoughts became a constant tug-of-war between what I knew was right and the desire that was rapidly becoming impossible to ignore. Greg was still absorbed in his work, our marriage more like a partnership of convenience than a relationship. And that realization hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't long before Michael reached out again. I was standing in the kitchen, making breakfast for Casey, when my phone buzzed. Seeing his name flash on the screen sent a thrill through me, even though I knew it shouldn't. "Hey, Claire, do you think we could talk? I feel like we need to figure out what happened between us." His message was short, but it hit me like a wave. I stood there for a moment, my phone in hand, my mind racing. I knew I shouldn't. I knew this could spiral out of control if I let it. But the thought of not seeing him again was unbearable. After hesitating for what felt like an eternity, I replied, "Sure. How about the Lavender Garden Cafe?" The familiar setting of the cafe felt like a safe choice, a place where I could keep things calm, at least on the surface. I didn't want to stir up more than I could handle. But deep down, I was already questioning whether that was even possible. When I arrived at the cafe, Michael was already seated, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. As I walked toward him, I could feel my heartbeat quicken. He stood up when I reached the table, his eyes lingering a little too long on the green skirt I had chosen specifically for this meeting. "You look amazing, Claire," he said, his voice low, and that familiar spark ignited again. I felt a blush creeping up my neck as I sat down. "Thanks, Michael. What did you want to talk about?" He leaned in, his voice soft but intense. "About us. About what's happening between us." His eyes locked onto mine, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I can't stop thinking about you. I know it's wrong, but I want you to know how I feel." His confession hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, caught between the thrill of his words and the crushing reality of what we were doing. But the truth was undeniable. I felt the same way. I don't know what to say," I whispered, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. "This shouldn't be happening, but it is," Michael finished for me, his voice almost a plea. "And I don't want to pretend it's not anymore." We talked for what felt like hours, the conversation shifting from light to heavy, each word drawing us closer, erasing the boundaries that once seemed so clear. When we finally stood to leave, he suggested we take a walk. Without thinking, I agreed. The air outside was cool, and the scent of blooming lavender filled the night, giving the moment an almost dreamlike quality. We walked in silence for a while, the tension between us building with every step. Finally, he stopped, turning to face me. "I don't want to fight this anymore," he said, his voice filled with raw emotion. "I want to be with you, Claire. I don't care what it takes." Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was filled with every suppressed desire I'd been trying to bury.
It wasn't soft this time.
It was desperate, passionate, like everything had been leading to this moment. His hands wrapped around my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt his fingers trace the edge of my skirt, sending shivers through me. When we finally pulled away, our breaths mingled in the cool night air, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. "I want to be with you too, Michael," I whispered, feeling my heart fill with both fear and excitement. And just like that, there was no going back. The days that followed were a blur. I was consumed by thoughts of Michael, his touch, his words, the intensity of his feelings. It was like a current had been switched on inside me, one I couldn't turn off. The guilt was still there, nagging at the edges, but it was like a distant echo compared to the rush I felt every time I remembered the way he looked at me. Greg, oblivious as ever, carried on with his routine. He barely noticed my absence when I spent long hours at the cafe or the extra effort I'd put into my appearance lately. He was wrapped up in his work, and as much as I hated to admit it, that made everything easier. Easier to hide. Easier to pretend nothing had changed, when in reality, everything had. One afternoon, a message from Michael popped up on my phone, interrupting my thoughts. I could feel my pulse quicken just seeing his name on the screen. "Hey, Claire.
Can we talk?"
There's something I've been thinking about. Meet me at the park by the old fountain." I hesitated for a moment, but only a moment. I knew I shouldn't keep seeing him, that every time we met, the risk of getting caught grew. But the thought of not going, it felt unbearable. I replied quickly, "I'll be there." I spent extra time getting ready that day, choosing a light ivory dress that I knew clung to my figure in all the right places. I told myself I was just dressing up for me, but deep down I knew better. As I made my way to the park, my heart pounded with anticipation. This was dangerous, and I knew it, but I couldn't stop. Michael was already waiting when I arrived. He was standing by the fountain, his expression tense, as if something was weighing on him. When he saw me, his face softened, but the intensity in his eyes was undeniable. It was like he was battling something inside, and I wasn't sure if he was winning or losing. "Claire," he began, his voice shaky, "I've been thinking about us, about what we're doing." I stood there, unsure of what to say. My own emotions were swirling, a mix of excitement and fear, but I could sense that this conversation was going to be different. He took a step closer, his hands finding mine. The touch sent a familiar jolt through me, but this time there was something deeper behind it, something raw. "I cannot keep pretending that I do not want more. I think about you every minute of the day. It is driving me crazy, Claire." His words hit me hard. I could feel the weight of them, and with each one, the conflict inside me grew sharper. On one hand, I felt a pull towards him stronger than anything I had ever felt before, but on the other, I couldn't ignore the reality of what we were doing. This wasn't just an affair, it was a betrayal. Of my marriage, of Greg, of everything I'd once believed in. I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "This isn't just some fling, Michael. I can't pretend it doesn't matter." He looked at me, his eyes full of longing and something close to desperation. I know it is more than that. That is why I can't stop. I do not care about the consequences anymore, Claire. I want to be with you." The truth hung between us, heavy and dangerous. I felt it in my bones, the recklessness of his words, and yet they mirrored what I had been feeling too. I didn't want to walk away. I didn't want to let go of the fire that had been ignited between us. But where would that leave me? What kind of person would I become if I gave in fully to this? "I want to be with you too," I said, my voice breaking slightly as the words tumbled out. I wasn't even sure if I should be saying them, but I knew they were the truth. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like we were both standing on the edge of something, looking down at the inevitable fall. And then, without another word, He pulled me close, his lips crashing against mine with a force that took my breath away. The kiss was filled with everything we had been holding back: weeks of tension, desire, confusion, and need. It was no longer a question of should we or could we. It was happening, and I didn't want to stop it. As his hand slid over my waist, pulling me closer, I felt the heat between us intensify. Every touch sent shivers through me, and I lost myself in the moment in him. The park, the world around us, it all faded away. There was only the two of us, and the storm of emotions we were caught in. When we finally pulled away, breathless, our foreheads rested together, both of us trying to catch our breath. His eyes were filled with emotion, and I knew mine must have been the same. There was no turning back now. "I don't know where this is going," I whispered, my voice barely steady. "But I can't pretend I don't feel this way." Michael nodded, his grip tightening around me. "We will figure it out. I cannot lose you now." In the days that followed, our secret meetings became more frequent. We found places to hide, quiet corners of parks, out-of-the-way cafes, anywhere we could be alone. Every moment with Michael felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between the thrill of the affair and the danger of it unraveling. We tried to keep things discreet, but the intensity between us was impossible to ignore. Each time we met, it felt like we were playing with fire, and every kiss, every touch, only made it burn hotter. Then came the day I had been dreading, the day it all came crashing down. It was a Sunday afternoon. Greg had taken Casey out for the day, giving me the house to myself. Michael had sent me a message earlier, asking if he could come over. I knew it was risky, but I had agreed. I couldn't stay away. When he arrived, there was an urgency in the air, something unspoken but understood between us. We didn't have much time, and every second felt precious. But as we stood there in the quiet of my home, something shifted. Maybe it was the familiarity of the space, our family pictures on the wall, the smell of Greg's cologne lingering in the hallway, but the guilt I had been suppressing finally bubbled to the surface. As Michael moved closer, his hands tracing the familiar path along my waist, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it almost knocked the air from my lungs. I don't know if we can keep doing this," I said, stepping back slightly, my heart pounding in my chest. Michael froze, his eyes searching mine. "What do you mean?" "Claire, we are in this together."
I thought.
"I know," I interrupted, my voice thick with emotion. "I know, but this is real. And I can't ignore the fact that I'm betraying everything I once valued. My family, my marriage, Greg." His face hardened slightly, a mix of frustration and hurt crossing his features. "What about us, Claire? What about what we have?" I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. I don't know what to do. But it's not just a secret anymore. It's my life. And I can't keep living like this." The words hung heavy between us, and for the first time, I felt the weight of what we were doing crash down around me. The days following our kiss at the park were a blur of emotions, guilt, and desire. Each time Michael and I met, the boundaries blurred further, and my heart ached with the weight of the decisions I was avoiding. I could barely look at Greg without feeling a knot twist tighter in my chest, but I couldn't stay away from Michael either. His touch, his words, they felt like a lifeline, pulling me towards something I couldn't resist, yet knew I shouldn't pursue. But Greg, he didn't deserve this. Every night, he came home exhausted, yet always kind, always thoughtful. He would ask about my day, about Casey's latest adventures, and all I could think about was how unfair it was to him. He trusted me. He believed in the life we had built together, and here I was, balancing on a tightrope between loyalty and temptation. One evening, the weight of everything became too much. Greg and I were sitting in the living room, the TV playing quietly in the background. Casey was already in bed, and the house was peaceful in the way it always was. But inside, I was unraveling. "Greg," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked over at me, his eyes soft and warm.
"Yeah?"
I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I had practiced this moment in my head 100 times, but now that it was here, the words felt heavy, stuck in my throat. How could I tell him? How could I admit what I had done? Something's been bothering me, I said slowly, trying to steady my voice. Greg leaned forward, concern etched on his face. What's wrong, Claire? I took a deep breath, feeling the air catch in my lungs. I've been feeling disconnected lately. From us. From everything. He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. What do you mean? I said, my voice trembling, I don't know who I am anymore. I've been lost. Greg's face softened, but I could see the worry behind his eyes. Claire, if there's something bothering you, we can work through it.
We always have.
I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that everything could be fixed with a conversation, that we could go back to how things were. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I had crossed a line, and there was no undoing what had happened with Michael. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Greg. His eyes widened, the concern turning into something darker. Claire, what are you saying? I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. I made a mistake, I choked out. I've been seeing someone else. The words hung in the air like a bomb, and I watched as Greg's face went pale. His eyes searched mine, disbelief and pain clouding his expression. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at me, as if he couldn't comprehend what I had just told him.
Who?
His voice was hollow, barely audible. It's Michael, I whispered, my heart shattering as I said the name aloud. Greg's face contorted with a mix of anger and betrayal, his hands clenching into fists. Michael? Our friend's son. His voice rose with each word, disbelief giving way to fury. How could you? I didn't have an answer. I had asked myself the same question over and over again. And still, I didn't know. It had just happened, and now there was no turning back. I never wanted this, I sobbed, burying my face in my hands. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Greg stood up abruptly, pacing the room as he tried to process what I had just confessed. This far? Claire, you've betrayed me, betrayed our family.
How long?
How long has this been going on? I wiped at my tears, my body trembling. A few months, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Greg let out a bitter laugh, his voice shaking with anger. Months? You've been lying to me for months. I stood up, desperate to make him understand. Greg, I never stopped loving you. I got lost. We got lost. And You what? He snapped, cutting me off. You thought screwing around with someone else was going to fix that? Was that supposed to make you feel better? His words cut deep, but I couldn't argue with him. He was right. I had made the worst mistake of my life, and now I was facing the consequences. I don't know what to say, I whispered, my voice trembling. I never wanted to hurt you. Greg stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with hurt. I need some time to think, he said finally, his voice cold. I can't even look at you right now. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. The days that followed were unbearable. Greg barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was with a coldness I had never seen in him before. We lived under the same roof, but it felt like we were miles apart. Every time I saw him, the guilt gnawed at me. I had destroyed the life we had built together, and I didn't know if we could ever repair it. My thoughts drifted to Michael, but even that didn't bring me the same comfort anymore. The thrill that had once consumed me was now tainted by the wreckage it had caused. One evening, Greg came home from work and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. The tension in the air was thick, and my heart raced, knowing this was the conversation that would decide everything. Claire, he began, his voice quiet but steady. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I nodded, unable to find the words. I'm hurt, he continued, angry. But more than anything, I'm disappointed. I thought we had something solid, something worth fighting for.
And now?
I don't know what we have anymore. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I opened my mouth to speak, but Greg held up his hand to stop me. But, he said, his voice softening, I also know that I've made mistakes too. I've been distant. I've buried myself in work, and I didn't see what was happening. I let us drift apart. My heart ached hearing him take some of the blame. Greg, it's not your fault. I'm the one who made the choice. I know that, he said, his eyes meeting mine. But I'm not ready to just give up on us, Claire. I'm not ready to throw away everything we've built together. I still love you, even though I'm hurt, and I'm willing to try and fix this if you are. I felt the tears spill over, running down my cheeks as I nodded. I love you too, Greg. I've never stopped loving you. And I'm so sorry. He reached across the table and took my hand, his touch gentle but firm. Then let's try. Let's figure this out one day at a time. In that moment, I felt a glimmer of hope, fragile but real. We had a long road ahead, filled with difficult conversations and healing, but for the first time in weeks, I believed that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. And I knew, deep down, that I was ready to fight for us. No more secrets, no more lies. Just the truth, and the love that we had almost lost but were willing to rebuild, piece by broken piece.